In the next 72 hours, a storm is forecast to nearly triple its strength. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not a worst case. It is the official forecast. The storm is called Bavi, and right now, east of Guam, it is a modest tropical storm blowing at 60 miles an hour. By this weekend, the warning centers expect it to be a super typhoon near 155, bearing down on small American islands still rebuilding from the last one. A few models push it even further, toward a record that has stood untouched for almost 50 years, and out over that empty ocean, there is no aircraft to fly in and tell us the truth of how strong it really is. So what happens when the strongest storm on Earth forms where only satellites can watch? But first, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now let's break this down. Part 1. 60 miles an hour. Right now, as you are listening to this, there is a storm sitting over the open Pacific Ocean that is not, by any normal measure, frightening. Its winds are blowing at about 60 miles an hour. That is barely a strong tropical storm. It is the kind of system that, on most days, would earn a single line at the bottom of a forecast and nothing more. And yet tonight, meteorologists on 3 different continents are staring at it with something close to dread, because nearly every computer model we have is saying the same thing. This quiet 60-mile-an-hour storm is about to become the most powerful thing on the entire planet. Its name is Bavi. As of the morning of July 2nd, 2026, it is a newly named tropical storm, wandering across the warm water of the western Pacific, well to the east of a small island called Guam and to the west of the Marshall Islands. If you saw it on a satellite loop right now, you would not be impressed. It is broad, a little ragged, still trying to pull itself together into a tight, organized spiral. But that is exactly the problem. That is exactly what the forecasters are afraid of. Because a storm that is still getting organized over water this warm is a storm that has not yet begun to show you what it can do. Here is the number that matters. The official forecast from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center calls for this 60-mile-an-hour storm to strengthen into a super typhoon with winds near 155 miles an hour in a little over 3 days. Let me say that again, slowly, so it lands. In roughly 72 hours, this storm is forecast to nearly triple its wind speed. That is not a gradual climb. That is not a storm slowly getting its act together over a week. That is an explosion, in slow motion, playing out over the open ocean. And it is pointed, more or less, at a handful of small American islands where about 200,000 people live. You need to understand what that word means, super typhoon, because we are going to be living inside it for the next couple of hours. A super typhoon is the top of the scale. It is the Western Pacific's version of a high-end Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane. It is the kind of storm that does not damage buildings so much as erase the weaker ones. And the forecast is not calling for Bavi to just barely reach that level. The forecast is calling for it to reach that level and keep going. But the official forecast, as alarming as it already is, may not even be the whole story. Because sitting behind it, whispered about in the forecast discussions and passed around online among the people who watch these things obsessively, is a second set of numbers. A few of the computer models, including one of the most respected long-range models in the world, have been showing Bavi's central pressure dropping to a level that, frankly, should not be possible. I will explain later exactly what central pressure is and why it is the single truest measure of a storm's fury. For now, just hold on to this. The lowest pressure ever measured inside any storm, anywhere on Earth, in all of recorded history, was 870. And some of these model runs have been showing Bavi flirting with numbers just a hair above that. They have been showing a storm knocking on the door of a record that has stood untouched since 1979. I want to be honest with you because that is the whole point of this channel. Those extreme numbers are outliers. They are single model runs, reaching out almost a week into the future, and the future is a slippery thing. The official centers are forecasting something more restrained, and we're going to take them seriously. But I also want you to sit with how strange it is that the phrase all-time world record is even in the conversation for a storm that this morning was blowing at a gentle 60 miles an hour. Storms that end up in the record books do not announce themselves. They start exactly like this. Quiet, unremarkable, sitting over warm water, waiting. And here is the part that turns this from a weather story into something stranger, something that has been keeping me up at night. We may never actually know how strong Bavi gets. In the Atlantic Ocean, When a hurricane threatens the United States, we send airplanes into it. Real planes, with real crews, flying straight into the eye to measure the pressure and the winds directly. Out here, over the Western Pacific, we do not do that. There are no hurricane hunters. There have not been for decades. Everything we know about a storm like Bavi, every estimate of its strength, comes from looking at it from space, from reading the shape and the temperature of its clouds and working backward. Which means that the strongest storm on the planet may be forming right now, and the best we can do is guess at its true power from 90 million miles away, through the eye of a satellite. So that is where we stand tonight. A storm that looks like nothing is forecast to become a monster that a few models say could rewrite the record books, a record that no aircraft will ever be sent to confirm, and a target, a cluster of small islands, that is about to have 4 days to get ready for something no one can yet measure. If you are the kind of person who finds that combination as unsettling as I do, then you are in the right place, and you're going to want to stay until the end, because the story of how this storm formed, where it is going, and why the ocean underneath it has become a machine for building monsters is genuinely one of the most remarkable things I've covered. Before we go any further, I want to promise you something. I am not going to hype this. I am not going to tell you the world is ending. What I am going to do is walk you through exactly what we know, exactly what we do not know, and exactly why the people whose entire job is to stay calm about these things are right now not calm. Because the truth of Bavi is scarier than any exaggeration, and it is scary precisely because so much of it is still unwritten. Let me start with a simple question, one that sounds easy but is not. Where did this thing even come from? How does the ocean take a patch of warm, damp air and in a matter of days spin it into the most powerful storm on the face of the earth? To answer that, we have to go back to a quiet stretch of water near the Marshall Islands a few days ago and watch the beginning. Because the beginning is where the warning signs were already there, if you knew what to look for. There is a lesson buried in the gap between how Bavi looks this morning and what it is forecast to become, and it is a lesson forecasters learn early and never forget. You cannot judge one of these storms by its appearance in the moment. A tropical cyclone is a promise written into the ocean and the air around it, and the promise can be terrifying long before the storm itself looks the part. The people who do this for a living are not reacting to what Bavi is right now. They are reacting to the environment it is sitting in, the fuel beneath it and the calm winds above it, and that environment is telling them, in a language they have spent careers learning to read, that this quiet storm has almost everything it needs to become something historic. It is a strange kind of alarm, being frightened of something that looks harmless. Think of it like a doctor reading a test result that the patient cannot feel yet. The symptoms have not arrived, but the diagnosis is already clear, and the responsible move is to act now, while there is still time, rather than to wait for the moment when everyone can finally see the danger for themselves. By the time Bavi looks like a monster on the satellite with a clean eye and a perfect spiral, the window to prepare will already be closing. That is exactly why we're talking about it tonight, while it is still only 60 miles an hour and still only a name on a map. Part 2. A name in the Marshall Islands. Every monster has a birthplace, and Bavi's is a stretch of ocean most people will never see and could not find on a map. It was born out near the Marshall Islands, a scattering of tiny coral atolls sitting almost alone in the middle of the Western Pacific, thousands of miles from any continent. This is one of the loneliest patches of water on the planet. It is also, for reasons we're going to get into, one of the most dangerous places on Earth for a storm to be born, because the ocean here is warm, it is warm far below the surface, and it is patient. It will feed anything that starts to spin. For days, this was nothing. It was what forecasters unglamorously call an area of disturbed weather, a loose knot of thunderstorms with no real centre, no organisation, no name. Most of these fizzle. The atmosphere is full of these little would-be storms that flare up and die without anyone noticing. But this one did not die. This one found the warm water, and it started to tighten, and at some point in the last day or so, it crossed the invisible line that separates a disorganized mess from a genuine tropical cyclone. And when a system crosses that line in this part of the world, it gets a name from a preset list. This one drew the name Bavi. By the morning of the 2nd of July, the forecasters had a fix on it. The centre of Bavi was sitting about 960 miles to the east of Guam, which is the largest of the islands in its path. It was crawling toward the west and slightly north, at only about 15 miles an hour, which is roughly the speed of a bicycle. And that slow speed matters because it means the storm is spending a long, unhurried amount of time over the warmest water, taking everything that ocean has to give. Think of it less like a car speeding down a highway and more like something grazing, feeding, growing heavier and stronger with every hour it lingers. Here is the detail that made me sit up when I read the morning discussion. Earlier that same morning, Bavi's winds had been clocked at around 45 miles an hour. By the time of the next official update, just hours later, they were up to about 60. That may not sound like much, but watch the direction of that change. In the span of a single morning, while forecasters were still writing their advisories, the storm was already strengthening under their pens. It was not waiting for the forecast to catch up. It was running ahead of it. And that, more than any single number, is the signal that experienced forecasters learn to fear, because a storm that is strengthening faster than expected on day 1 is a storm that tends to keep surprising you on day 3. Remember what I told you at the start. This whole story is about a storm forming over the hottest water on Earth, aimed at small islands that no aircraft will fly into. Right now, we are watching the forming part happen in real time, and the water is doing exactly what the water does. It is worth pausing on what Bavi actually looks like at this stage because the appearance is deceiving. A storm this young does not have the clean, terrifying eye you see in the famous satellite photos. It has broad bands of thunderstorms, wrapping loosely, a centre that wobbles and reforms. To an untrained eye it looks almost harmless. But the forecasters are not looking at what it is. They are looking at what it is sitting on top of, and what is spreading out above it, and both of those things are screaming. The path it is on is the thing that turns all of this from an interesting piece of ocean physics into an emergency. Bavi is moving west-northwest, and if you draw that line forward across the map, it runs almost straight into the Mariana Islands. Not near them, into them. The forecast brings the centre of this storm through or just south of that island chain in about 3 to 4 days, right around Sunday the 5th and Monday the 6th of July. And it does not arrive as the gentle 60-mile-an-hour storm we see today. By the time it reaches those islands, if the forecast holds, it will have gone through its transformation. It will arrive as a monster. There is a cruel piece of timing buried in those dates that I have to point out. The impacts are forecast to arrive on Sunday and Monday, which means the window to get ready slams shut on Saturday, the 4th of July. The last hours of safe preparation fall on a holiday, on the weekend, when supplies are already stretched and people are already distracted. Forecasters covering these islands have been blunt about it. Whatever you're going to do to protect yourself and your family, they are saying it needs to be done by Saturday afternoon. After that, the outer edges of the storm start to arrive, and the time for preparation is simply over. So the clock is not an abstraction. It is real, and it is short, and it is already running. A storm that is still a shapeless 60-mile-an-hour swirl this morning has a hard appointment with a cluster of inhabited islands in 72 hours, and it plans to arrive as something the record books might not have a category for. The question that everything now hangs on is a question about those islands. Who exactly lives in the path of this thing? What kind of place is about to take a direct hit from the strongest storm on the planet? Because it turns out the target is smaller and more exposed and more familiar with this particular nightmare than you might expect. The name itself comes from a system most people never think about. Storms in this part of the world are named from a set of rotating lists, contributed by the many nations that share this ocean, and the names are recycled every few years unless a storm is so deadly that its name is retired out of respect. Bavi is simply the next name on the list, drawn without ceremony, attached now to something that may end up being remembered for a very long time. There is something almost arbitrary about it, a monster wearing whatever name happened to be next in line. I keep coming back to that slow forward speed, about 15 miles an hour, because it is easy to hear the word slow and think of it as good news. It is not. A storm that crawls is a storm that lingers, and lingering over the warmest water on the planet is exactly what a developing typhoon wants to do. Every extra hour Bavi spends grazing over that heat is another hour of fuel poured into the engine. If it were racing across the ocean, it might not have time to fully organize before reaching the islands. Instead, it is taking its time, feeding as it goes, and that unhurried pace is part of why the forecasters believe it will arrive at the Marianas near its terrible peak, rather than still on the way up. Part 3. 4. Small Islands. Pull the map in close. past the wide blue emptiness of the Pacific, and you will find them. 4 small islands, strung out in a gentle line, almost lost in the ocean around them. From south to north they are Guam, then Rota, then Tinian, then Saipan. Together with a few smaller specks they make up the Mariana Islands. And here is the first thing most people do not realize about them. They are American. Guam is a territory of the United States. The islands just to its north, Rota and Tinian and Saipan, make up a place called the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, which is also United States soil. The people who live here are, in the fullest sense, Americans, even though they sit more than 7,000 miles from Washington, closer to Tokyo than to Hawaii. About 200,000 people call these islands home. Roughly 150,000 of them live on Guam, which is the largest and busiest of the group. Another 47,000 or so are spread across Saipan, Tinian and Rota to the north. These are real communities, with schools and hospitals and power plants and harbours sitting on small pieces of land in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. And that phrase, small pieces of land, is not a throwaway detail. It is, when a super typhoon is coming, the single most important fact about them. Let me explain why the size of these islands matters so much, because it changes everything about what a direct hit means. When a hurricane strikes a large landmass, like the coast of Texas or Florida, the storm makes landfall in one place, and people even 100 miles inland experience something far weaker. There is room to move, there is somewhere to go. You can drive away from the coast and put distance between yourself and the worst of it. On an island that is only a few miles wide, none of that is possible. When the eye of a super typhoon passes over a small island, the entire island is inside the storm. The eye wall, which is the ring of the most violent wind and rain wrapped around the calm centre, does not clip one neighbourhood. It swallows the whole place at once. There is no inland, there is no away, there is only the storm and the ocean and whatever walls you're hiding behind. This is the reality that Bavi is now bearing down on. Remember the thread we are following, a storm growing over the hottest water on Earth, aimed at small islands that no plane will fly into. The small islands part is not a soft detail. It is the reason the stakes are so high. A monster storm passing over open water is a spectacle. The same storm passing over an island only a few miles across is a catastrophe for every single person on it. There is a reason these particular islands sit at the centre of so many storm stories. They lie in a part of the Western Pacific that meteorologists sometimes call, only half-jokingly, Typhoon Alley. This is the most active tropical cyclone region on the entire planet. More storms form here, and more strong storms form here, than in any other ocean basin on Earth. The Marianas sit right in the firing line, out in the open water where storms are still young and hungry, and often still strengthening. A hurricane hitting the United States mainland has usually crossed a lot of ocean and is often past its peak. A typhoon hitting the Marianas is frequently a storm on the way up, catching the islands while it is still gathering its full strength. That is the worst possible time to be in a storm's path, and it is precisely the situation forecasters are worried about with Bavi. Now, the exact aim is still being worked out, and this is where the forecast gets genuinely tense. The different computer models do not fully agree on which of these 4 islands takes the centre. Some of the guidance, including the main American model, brings the core right over Tinian and Saipan, the 2 islands to the north. Other guidance, including the main European model, nudges the track a little farther south, toward Rota and Guam. That difference of maybe 50 or 60 miles sounds small on a map that spans an entire ocean. But for the people living on these islands, that 50 miles is the difference between a direct blow and a glancing one, between the eye wall and the outer bands. And because the storm is expected to be large, even the islands that avoid the exact centre are not going to be spared. A near miss from a super typhoon is still, for a small island, a very bad day. So this is the target, not a big coastline where people can flee inland. 4 small islands, home to 200,000 Americans, sitting in the most storm-prone patch of ocean on the planet, in the exact spot where storms tend to be youngest and strongest, with the models still arguing over which of them gets the worst of it. It would be a frightening setup for any community, anywhere. But for these particular islands there is an extra layer to it, a layer that makes the fear on the ground right now sharper and more personal than a forecast alone can explain. Because the people of Saipan and Tinian have been here before, not years ago, not decades ago, this year. And what happened the last time is the reason nobody out there is treating Bavi as just another storm. Guam, the largest of these islands, is not just a home to 150,000 people. It is one of the most strategically important pieces of ground the United States holds anywhere in the Pacific, home to a major air base and a deep-water naval presence that anchor American power across half the globe. When a super typhoon takes aim at Guam, it is not only a humanitarian emergency. It is a threat to infrastructure that matters far beyond the island itself. That is part of why these storms draw such intense attention and why the preparations run so deep. The people of the Marianas are not naive about typhoons. They live in one of the most storm-tested places on Earth, and their building codes and their concrete construction reflect it. Many of the homes here are built of reinforced concrete precisely because wood and light materials do not survive in Typhoon Alley. That hard-won toughness has saved countless lives over the years, but there is a ceiling even to that toughness, and a genuine super typhoon, especially one striking buildings already weakened by an earlier storm this same year, can find the limits of even well-built concrete. Preparedness buys margin. It does not buy immunity, and no one on these islands pretends that it does. The people who live here have a name and a history that long predate any of this. The Chamorro people have inhabited the Marianas for thousands of years, and their culture has been shaped, in part, by the very storms that threaten it. Generations of living in Typhoon Alley have bred a particular kind of resilience, a communal instinct to secure homes, share what you have, and check on the neighbours when the sky turns wrong. That social fabric is one of the island's greatest defences, often more important in the aftermath than any building code. When the power fails and the outside world is cut off, it is neighbours helping neighbours that carries a community through the first days. But resilience is not the same as invulnerability, and it is a comfortable mistake, made from far away, to assume that because these islands have survived storms before, they will simply shrug off this one too. Every community has a threshold, a level of blow beyond which even the toughest preparation is overwhelmed, and a genuine super typhoon making a direct pass is exactly the kind of event that can find it. The island's long experience with storms is a reason for respect, not for complacency. The people here know better than anyone that the ocean does not grade on a curve, and that surviving the last storm guarantees nothing about the next one. Part 4. It already happened once. This year. To understand the fear on these islands tonight, you have to go back only about 11 weeks, to April of this same year, 2026. Because Bavi is not the first monster to come for the Marianas this season, it is the second. Its name was Sinlaku, and it followed almost the exact same script that Bavi is following now. It started as a tropical storm out in the open western Pacific. It found the warm water, it began to intensify, and it kept intensifying, and it climbed all the way to super typhoon strength as it bore down on the same island chain we're talking about tonight. The warning centres issued typhoon warnings for Rota, for Tinian, for Saipan. The islands braced, and then Sinlaku arrived, and it did what a super typhoon does to a small island. It took the place apart. The reports from the days afterward tell a grim story. On Saipan and Tinian, the two northern islands, Sinlaku crippled the power grid, tore up the roads, and knocked out key pieces of the infrastructure that a community needs to simply function. When you hear a phrase like knocked out the power, on the mainland you might picture a few hours of darkness, an inconvenience, a reason to light some candles. On a small, isolated island, it means something far heavier. It means the water pumps stop because they run on electricity. It means the hospitals fall back on generators, and generators run on fuel, and fuel has to be shipped in across thousands of miles of ocean. It means the airport, which is the lifeline for everything, may be too damaged to receive the planes bringing help. When a super typhoon breaks a small island, it does not just break the buildings, it breaks the systems that keep people alive, and those systems can take weeks or months to put back together. That is the storm these islands took in April, and here is the part that matters most for tonight. They are not finished recovering from it. Rebuilding after a storm like Sinlaku is slow, painstaking work, especially in a place where every replacement part, every roll of roofing, every utility pole has to cross an ocean to get there. Some homes still have tarps where roofs used to be. Some repairs are half done. Some of the infrastructure is running on temporary fixes rather than true replacements. The island is standing, but it is standing on a patch job. And now, into that half-healed landscape, the forecasts are pointing a second super typhoon, one that a few models suggest could be even stronger than the first. This is why I keep coming back to the same thread. and I want you to hold it with me, because it is the spine of everything. A storm is growing over the hottest water on Earth. It is aimed at small islands, and no aircraft will fly into it to tell us how strong it truly is. Tonight I want to add a fourth piece to that, because it is the piece that makes this specific storm feel almost unfair. Those small islands have already been hit this year, and they have not gotten back up yet. Think about what that does to the math of survival. A building that took a direct hit from Sinlaku and was patched back together is not as strong as it was before. The structure has been stressed, the weak points have been found, a roof that was re-nailed in a hurry, a wall that was braced rather than rebuilt, a window that was boarded rather than replaced. All of these will face Bavi in a weakened state. Storms do not care about effort. They find the seams, and Sinlaku has spent the last 3 months, unintentionally, showing Bavi exactly where the seams on these islands are. There is a human dimension to this that no forecast chart can capture. The people on these islands are being asked to do something that would break most of us. They are being asked to prepare again for the worst storm of their lives, while they are still cleaning up from the last worst storm of their lives. Imagine boarding up a window you only just replaced. Imagine restocking an emergency kit you only recently used. Imagine standing in your yard, looking at repairs you have been working on for weeks, and knowing that in 72 hours they might all be undone. That is the emotional weight sitting on the Marianas tonight, underneath the wind speed numbers and the model charts. It is not just a physical vulnerability, it is a kind of exhaustion, a sense of being singled out, that is entirely understandable and entirely justified. And it raises a question that a lot of people out there are asking, sometimes quietly and sometimes not so quietly. Why here? Why these islands twice in one season? Is there something going on beyond bad luck? We are going to take that question seriously later, including the versions of it that drift into conspiracy, because it deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissive one. But the short version, the version grounded in physics rather than fear, comes back to the water. These islands sit in the one part of the world most likely to manufacture storms like this, over an ocean that this year is running warmer than usual. The cruelty is real, the targeting is not. And to see why, we have to stop looking at the islands and start looking down at the ocean itself, because the ocean is where this monster is actually being built. When people on the mainland lose power, help is usually a state or two away, reachable by truck within hours. On an isolated island, there is no neighbouring state to send convoys. Everything that comes to the rescue, every generator, every crew, every pallet of water, has to arrive by ship or by plane across thousands of miles of ocean, and only if the harbour and the airport are still working. A super typhoon has a cruel habit of damaging the very lifelines that recovery depends on, cratering the runway, wrecking the port, so that the island is hardest to reach at the exact moment it most needs reaching. That is why island recoveries stretch into months rather than days. Sinlaku did not just break things in April, it started a clock that is still running. Every roof retarped, every pole reset, every stretch of road patched, represents weeks of labour and a supply chain stretched to its limit, and a community can only rebuild so fast when the parts have to cross an ocean to arrive. That is the honest reason the islands are not fully healed 3 months later. It is not for lack of effort. It is the simple, unforgiving arithmetic of being small and far away, and it is the reason Bavi is arriving to find so much still unfinished. Part 5. The Cruelty of Twice. There is a particular kind of dread that only comes from repetition, and the Marianas are living inside it right now. The first time a disaster comes, it is a shock. It arrives out of a clear sky, metaphorically speaking, and catches you in the ordinary rhythm of your life. The second time, in the same season, with the wreckage of the first still around you, it is something else entirely. It is not a shock, it is a return. And returns are, in their own way, worse, because you know exactly what is coming, and you know exactly how much it hurt. I want to spend a moment on this because it is easy, from a comfortable distance, to reduce a storm to statistics. Winds of 155 miles an hour, pressure of 925, a track that passes south of Tinian on Monday morning. Those numbers are essential, and we are going to spend a lot of time on them tonight. But they are not what it feels like to be a parent on Saipan this evening, looking at the forecast on your phone, doing the quiet arithmetic of whether the roof you just fixed will hold, whether there is enough fuel, whether the shelter still has space, whether you should try to get the family off the island entirely while the airport is still open. That arithmetic is happening in tens of thousands of homes right now, and it is happening for the second time in 3 months. The compounding is not only emotional, it is brutally physical, and it stacks the odds in the storm's favour. Consider what Sinlaku left behind. Every structure that survived it survived by absorbing damage. The energy of that storm went somewhere. It went into cracked concrete, into loosened fasteners, into bent frames and stressed joints that may look fine from the street, but have lost some hidden fraction of their strength. Engineers have a concept for this. They call it accumulated damage, the idea that a structure remembers every load it has ever taken, and that each successive blow starts from a weaker baseline. A wall rated to survive a certain wind speed when it was new is not rated for that same speed after it has already been half destroyed and patched. So when Bavi's winds arrive, they will be pushing against buildings that are, quietly, less able to resist than they were in March. The same wind that a healthy structure might shrug off could be the wind that finishes a wounded one. And then there is the simple problem of supply. An island only holds so much plywood, so much bottled water, so much generator fuel, so much of everything that a community reaches for when a storm is coming. Sinlaku drained those reserves in April. Some of them have been replenished over the last 3 months, shipped in slowly across the ocean. But some of them have not been fully restocked, because restocking takes time and money and cargo space, all of which have been going toward rebuilding. So Bavi is arriving to find the pantry half empty. The islands are being asked to face a bigger storm with fewer of the things you need to survive a storm. This is what I mean when I say the timing is cruel. It is not just that a second storm is coming, it is that it is coming before the first one's wounds have closed. Keep the thread in your mind because it explains why this matters. A monster is forming over the warmest water on the planet. It is aimed at these exact small islands. We cannot fly a plane into it to measure its true strength, and the islands it is aimed at are already hurt. Every one of those factors makes the others worse. The wound from Sinlaku makes the islands more fragile. The warm water makes Bavi stronger. The lack of aircraft makes the strength uncertain, which makes preparing harder. Because how do you prepare for a storm when the experts themselves are honest that they are not sure how bad it will get? Uncertainty in a situation like this is not comforting. It is its own kind of threat, because it forces you to prepare for the worst version while hoping for a milder one. I do not say any of this to frighten you for the sake of it. I say it because the people living through it deserve to have their situation described honestly, and because the rest of us, watching from safe places, should understand that what is happening here is not just weather. It is a test of a small, isolated community's endurance, applied twice in a single season, and it is a preview of a question that is going to matter more and more as the oceans warm. What happens when disasters start to arrive faster than communities can recover from them? What happens when the gap between storms shrinks below the time it takes to rebuild? The Marianas are right now an unwilling experiment in exactly that question, and the results are being written in real time on their shores. But to really understand Bavi, to understand why it is capable of becoming what the forecasts say it will become, we cannot keep our eyes on the islands. We have to turn them downward to the water. Because everything about this storm, its speed, its potential record-flirting strength, the very fact that it exists at all, comes from what is happening in the ocean beneath it. And what is happening in that ocean this summer is something that turns a stretch of the Pacific into the most efficient machine for building monsters that exists anywhere on Earth. Let me show you how that machine works, and why, this year, it is running hotter than usual. Psychologists who study communities hit by repeated disasters have a name for what settles over a place in a situation like this. They talk about disaster fatigue, the way that repeated blows wear down not just buildings but people, draining the reserves of energy and hope and money that recovery requires. The first storm is met with adrenaline and resolve. The second, arriving before the first is even cleaned up, is met by people who are already tired, already stretched thin, already grieving what they lost. That exhaustion is not weakness. It is the entirely human response to being asked to do the impossible twice in one season, and it interacts with the physical danger in a way that makes both worse. A tired community prepares less thoroughly, not because it cares less, but because there is only so much any group of people can do. Supplies that were used in April may not be fully replaced. The volunteer who worked himself to exhaustion after Sinlaku has less to give this time. So the compounding is total. The buildings are weaker, the supplies are thinner, and the people are more tired all at once. Bavi is not just arriving at a wounded place, it is arriving at a place whose capacity to absorb another wound has already been partly spent. Part 6. The hottest water on Earth. If you could drain the Pacific Ocean and look at the heat stored in it the way you would read a thermal map, one region would glow brighter than anywhere else on the planet. It sits in the Western Pacific, an enormous pool of the warmest open ocean water on Earth, and it is no accident that this is exactly where the strongest storms in recorded history have been born. Bavi is forming on the edge of this warm pool, and it is drifting deeper into it with every hour. To understand why forecasters are using words like record and monster, you have to understand what is sitting under this storm because it is the closest thing nature has to rocket fuel. Warm water is not just a pleasant detail for a storm, it is the entire power source. A tropical cyclone is, at its core, a machine for converting ocean heat into wind, and the warmer the water, the more heat there is to convert. Forecasters watch a specific threshold. When the surface of the ocean is at about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 26 or 27 degrees Celsius, a storm can survive. When it climbs past that, into the range of 29, 30, even 31 degrees Celsius, which is well into the 80s on the Fahrenheit scale, a storm can do far more than survive. It can explode. The water underneath Bavi is in exactly that dangerous upper range. But surface temperature is only half the story, and it is the half that fools people. What truly matters is not just how warm the very top of the ocean is, but how far down that warmth goes. Meteorologists call this ocean heat content, and it is the single most underrated number in this entire forecast. Here is why it matters. As a storm sits and spins, its winds churn the sea, dragging up water from below. If the warm layer is thin, the storm pulls cooler water to the surface and, in effect, chokes on its own exhaust, cutting off its fuel. But if the warm water runs far below the surface, the storm can churn all it wants and still find nothing but more warmth underneath. The fuel tank, in that case, is not just full, it is bottomless. And the Western Pacific warm pool, where Bavi now sits, has some of the highest ocean heat content found anywhere on the planet. Hold on to the thread here, because this is the answer to the question we have been circling. Why is a monster forming? Why is it aimed at these islands? Why can this storm reach strengths that would tear up the record books? The answer, underneath everything, is this water. The islands are in the path because the islands sit in the warm pool's firing line. The storm can become a monster because the warm pool will feed it without limit. Everything traces back to the heat in the sea, and this year, that heat is running even higher than usual, which is where the story reaches out and touches the rest of the planet. The tropical Pacific right now is sitting in a warm phase. There is a specific number climate scientists track, a measure of how far above or below normal the central Pacific sea surface temperatures are running, and right now it sits at about positive 0.48. That is just a hair below the threshold that would officially be called an El Niño, the well-known warm pattern that reshapes weather across the globe. In plain terms, the Pacific is warm, it is getting warmer, and the baseline that Bavi is building on has been nudged upward. A storm forming over an already warm ocean during a warm-leaning year is a storm that has been handed an even bigger fuel supply than normal. There is something almost unsettling about how connected this all is. The same ocean warmth that is loading Bavi with energy is part of the same overheated global pattern that has been driving record heat on land in other parts of the world this very week. It is not that one is causing the other in some simple, direct way. It is that they are both symptoms of the same underlying condition, a planet whose oceans are holding more heat than they used to. Bavi is not an isolated freak event. It is what an overheated ocean produces, given the right spark. And the Western Pacific this summer is providing both the heat and the spark in the same place. So that is the stage. The warmest large body of water on the planet running warmer than usual, with heat stored not just at the surface but far below it, ready to feed anything that starts to spin. Bavi has found that water, and it is settling in to feed. But warm water on its own does not make a super typhoon. If it did, the tropics would be nothing but monsters, all the time. There is a second half to this machine, a set of conditions in the air above the storm that has to line up just right. And right now, above Bavi, those conditions are lining up almost perfectly. Let me show you how the ocean actually turns its heat into a killer, step by step, because once you see the engine running, you will understand exactly why this storm is forecast to do what it is about to do. There is a way to picture ocean heat content that makes its importance obvious. Imagine 2 pots of water on a stove, both heated to the same temperature at the surface. One is shallow, only an inch deep. The other is a foot deep. Touch the surface and they feel identical. But try to keep a fire burning above each one, a fire that keeps stealing heat from the water, and the shallow pot cools almost immediately while the deep one keeps giving up warmth for far longer. The ocean under Bavi is the deep pot. Its warmth does not run out when the storm starts churning it. That is what turns a storm that might have peaked and faded into one that can keep intensifying for days. This year, the whole system is tilted warm, and that tilt is measured by that index we mentioned, sitting at about positive 0.48 and climbing toward the threshold of a full El Niño. What that means, in practical terms, is that the baseline itself has been raised. Bavi is not building on an ordinary ocean. It is building on an ocean that is running a fever, and a storm handed extra heat is a storm handed a higher ceiling. The warm pool has always been the planet's most productive nursery for monsters. This summer, it is even more productive than usual, and Bavi is the first major test of just how much that extra warmth can do. Part 7. How the Ocean Builds a Monster. Let me take you inside the engine, because a Typhoon is a machine, and once you see how the machine works, its behavior stops being mysterious and starts being predictable, which is somehow more frightening. The whole thing runs on a simple loop, a feedback cycle that, once it starts turning fast enough, can spin up almost out of control. It begins with evaporation. The warm ocean surface gives up water vapor into the air, and that vapor carries with it an enormous amount of hidden energy, the energy it took to turn liquid water into gas. That warm, wet air rises, because warm air rises, and as it climbs high into the atmosphere it cools, and the vapor condenses back into liquid, forming the towering thunderstorm clouds that make up the body of the storm. And here is the crucial part. When that vapor condenses, it releases all that hidden energy back out as heat. That heat warms the core of the storm. A warmer core is a lighter core, and a lighter core means lower pressure at the surface underneath it. And lower pressure pulls in more air from around it, air that rushes across the warm ocean, picking up still more moisture, feeding still more thunderstorms, releasing still more heat. Round and round it goes. Evaporation feeds the clouds release heat, the heat lowers the pressure, the low pressure pulls in more wind, and the wind drives more evaporation. Each turn of the loop makes the next turn stronger. That is the engine. And when nothing gets in its way, that engine can accelerate with terrifying speed. But the engine is delicate. Several things have to be right at the same time for it to run at full power, and the reason forecasters are so alarmed about Bavi is that, right now, every single one of those things is right. The first requirement is the warm water we just talked about, with heat running far below the surface. Bavi has that. The second requirement is something called low wind shear, and this one is worth understanding, because it is often what separates a monster from a dud. Wind shear is the change in wind speed and direction as you go up through the atmosphere. If the winds high above the storm are blowing hard in a different direction than the winds near the surface, they tilt the storm over, they tear the top off the chimney, and they let all that carefully built heat leak out the side. A storm in high shear is like a fire in a strong crosswind. It cannot build. But when the shear is low, when the winds are gentle and uniform from the surface all the way up, the chimney stands perfectly straight, the heat stays trapped in the core, and the engine runs at maximum efficiency. Bavi right now is sitting under low shear. The chimney is standing straight. The third requirement is moisture in the middle levels of the atmosphere. Dry air is a storm killer. If dry air gets sucked into the system, it causes the rising air to evaporate its cloud droplets and sink, punching holes in the engine. But the air around Bavi is humid all the way up, which means nothing is choking the machine from the sides. The fourth requirement is good exhaust, what forecasters call outflow. All that air rushing into the bottom of the storm has to go somewhere once it reaches the top, and if it cannot escape, it backs up and strangles the whole circulation. A healthy storm has strong winds high aloft that carry the exhausted air away, like a chimney with a powerful draft. Bavi has that outflow, spreading out neatly at the top, keeping the whole engine breathing freely. Put all of that together, and you understand why this specific patch of ocean has earned its dark reputation. The Western Pacific, and especially the stretch of it called the Philippine Sea that Bavi is heading toward, routinely lines up all four of these ingredients at once. warm water with heat far below the surface, low shear, moist air, and strong outflow. It is, functionally, a factory for building the strongest storms on Earth. It has produced more record-breaking monsters than any other ocean basin in the world. And this summer, with the water running warmer than usual, the factory is operating at full capacity. Bavi did not get lucky. It rolled off an assembly line that was built by pure geography and physics to produce exactly this. So keep the thread with me. A storm is forming over the hottest water on the planet aimed at small islands, and no plane will fly into it. Now you know why that water is so dangerous, and why the air above it is so perfectly arranged to help. But there is one more concept, one specific and chilling piece of behaviour that this engine is capable of, and it is the thing that turns Bavi from a serious storm into a potential nightmare. It has a name that makes hurricane specialists go quiet when they say it. It is called rapid intensification, and it is the reason a 60-mile-an-hour storm this morning can become a 155-mile-an-hour monster by the weekend. Let me explain what it is, and why it is the most feared word in this entire science. The most recognizable feature of a mature storm, the eye, is a direct product of this engine running at full power. As the pressure at the center drops and the winds accelerate around it, the very center becomes a place where air is actually sinking rather than rising, clearing the clouds and creating that eerie circle of calm surrounded by the most violent winds on the planet, the eye wall. The presence of a clean, well-formed eye is one of the clearest satellite signs that a storm has reached the top tier of intensity. When forecasters start to see Bavi cut a sharp eye, they will know the engine has fully engaged. Physicists sometimes describe a hurricane as a natural heat engine, converting the temperature difference between the warm ocean surface and the cold upper atmosphere into mechanical energy, into wind. And like any engine, its efficiency depends on that temperature difference. The warmer the sea and the colder the air aloft, the more powerful the engine can become. Over the Western Pacific warm pool, that contrast is about as extreme as the planet offers, which is another way of saying this is where the atmosphere can build its most efficient, most powerful engines. Bavi is being assembled in the one workshop on Earth best equipped to build a record. Part 8. The most feared word in the science. There is a phrase that hurricane specialists use carefully, almost reluctantly, because they know what it does to a forecast and to the people relying on it. The phrase is rapid intensification, and Bavi is forecast to do it in a big way. Understanding this one concept is the key to understanding why this storm is so dangerous, so let me slow all the way down and make it clear, because it is the difference between a storm you can plan for and a storm that gets ahead of you. Rapid intensification has an actual technical definition. It is when a storm's maximum winds increase by at least 35 miles an hour within a single 24-hour period. That is the official line in the sand. Now look at what Bavi is forecast to do. It starts at about 60 miles an hour on the 2nd of July. It is forecast to reach roughly 155 miles an hour by around the 5th. That is an increase of about 95 miles an hour in roughly 3 days. The storm is not just forecast to meet the threshold for rapid intensification. It is forecast to blow through it, potentially more than doubling the minimum definition. This is not a storm expected to strengthen. This is a storm expected to detonate. To feel why that is so frightening, you have to think about it from the point of view of the people in its path. Imagine you are on Saipan, and the forecast on Thursday says a tropical storm is coming, winds around 60, unpleasant but survivable. You make reasonable plans for a tropical storm. Then Friday comes and it is a typhoon. Then Saturday comes and it is a super typhoon, and the storm you prepared for at 60 miles an hour is now bearing down at 155, and the window to do anything more about it is closed. That is the trap of rapid intensification. It does not just make a storm stronger, it makes the storm stronger faster than human beings can adjust. It outruns the boarding of windows, the stocking of shelters, the decision to evacuate. History is full of storms that killed not because they were unpredictable in theory, but because they strengthened so fast in practice that the warnings could not keep up with the reality. Now, why does it happen? Why does a storm suddenly shift from a gradual climb into a violent surge? It comes back to that feedback loop I described, the one where evaporation feeds the clouds release heat, the heat drops the pressure, and the low pressure pulls in more wind. Most of the time, something holds that loop in check. There is a little too much shear, or a pocket of dry air, or the water is not quite warm enough, and the engine runs at a moderate pace. But when every break comes off at once, when the water is scorching and the shear vanishes and the air is humid and the exhaust is flowing freely, the loop stops being gentle. Each turn amplifies the next with nothing to slow it down, and the storm's core can warm and its pressure can crash in a matter of hours. It is the atmospheric equivalent of a chain reaction, and Bavi is heading into precisely the conditions that let that chain reaction run. Here is the part that keeps forecasters humble and honest and awake at night. Rapid intensification is one of the hardest things in all of weather to predict. We have gotten remarkably good at forecasting where a storm will go. The track forecasts today are genuinely impressive, often accurate days in advance. But forecasting how strong a storm will get, and especially forecasting these sudden bursts of intensification, remains stubbornly difficult because it depends on small-scale processes deep inside the storm that our instruments and models struggle to see. This means there is real uncertainty baked into Bavi's forecast, and crucially, that uncertainty is not symmetric in a comforting way. When forecasters are unsure about a storm sitting over water this warm, the surprises have historically tended to come on the stronger side, not the weaker one. This is exactly why the warning centres are not waiting to sound the alarm. They are not going to see 60 miles an hour today and relax. They have watched too many storms in this exact patch of ocean do exactly this: take a running start and leap into the top of the scale in the time it takes to get through a weekend. They are forecasting the leap now, while there is still time for people to act, because the entire lesson of rapid intensification is that if you wait until you can see the monster clearly, it is already too late to prepare for it. So let me bring the thread back, because it is tightening. A storm is forming over the hottest water on Earth. It is aimed at small islands that are already wounded, and it is forecast to undergo one of the most dangerous behaviours a storm can exhibit, a violent surge in strength that could arrive faster than the islands can brace for it. That would be a frightening enough picture on its own. But there is one final factor that takes this from frightening to genuinely strange, and it is the factor I keep circling back to, because it hangs over everything. As this storm undergoes its rapid intensification, as it potentially climbs towards strengths we have almost never seen, there will be no one there to measure it. Let me explain why the strongest storm on the planet may unfold, with almost nobody able to say, for certain, how strong it truly got. The history of tropical meteorology is, in many ways, a history of storms that intensified faster than anyone expected and caught people unprepared. Again and again, in basins around the world, communities have gone to bed expecting a manageable storm and woken to a monster, because in the final 12 or 24 hours the system found the perfect conditions and simply exploded. Those events are seared into the memory of every forecaster, and they are the reason a professional looks at Bavi's setup and feels a chill rather than reaching for reassurance. The pattern of a storm deepening violently right before it reaches land is not an exotic edge case. It is one of the most repeated and most deadly stories in the entire science. There is even a phenomenon that can make an intensifying giant briefly stumble, and it is worth knowing about, because you may see it in Bavi's numbers over the coming days. Very strong storms sometimes go through what is called an eye wall replacement cycle, where the original eye wall is choked out by a new, larger ring of thunderstorms forming around it. During that process, the storm can weaken slightly for a few hours, and then, once the new eye wall contracts and takes over, it can re-intensify, often growing larger and spreading its punishing winds over an even wider area. So if you see Bavi's winds dip briefly this weekend, do not exhale. It may not be the storm falling apart. It may be the storm reloading. We have genuinely gotten better at this. The tools that forecast rapid intensification have improved a great deal in recent years, and the warning centres now flag the risk earlier and more confidently than they could a generation ago. But better is not solved. The internal machinery of a storm, the small bursts of thunderstorms near the core that can trigger a sudden deepening, still unfolds at a scale our models struggle to fully capture. That is why the honest forecast for Bavi is a range rather than a single number, and why the top of that range is so alarming. When the science tells you a storm could reach a certain strength but cannot promise it will stop there, the only safe assumption is the strong one. Let me put the pace of this into terms you can feel. A storm strengthening at the rate Bavi is forecast to strengthen is gaining roughly 30 miles an hour of wind speed per day, day after day, for 3 straight days. Imagine standing on a coast and knowing that the storm offshore is becoming meaningfully more dangerous every single hour, that the version of it you see at noon will be weaker than the version you see at dusk, and weaker still than the one that arrives in the dark. There is no settling, no plateau to plan around. The target keeps moving, always in the direction of worse, right up until it is on top of you. This is why forecasters talk about the next 24 to 48 hours as the pivotal window. It is during this stretch, out over the open ocean, that Bavi will either fulfill the frightening forecast or fall short of it, and the difference comes down to whether the perfect conditions hold. If the shear stays low and the water stays hot and the air stays moist, the engine runs unchecked and the monster gets built. If some subtle disruption sneaks in, the storm could end up strong but not catastrophic. We are right now in the exact hours when that outcome is being decided, and no one, not the best forecaster alive, can tell you for certain which way it will break. Part 9. Nobody is flying into this. Here is something most people in the United States assume, without ever really thinking about it, and it is wrong in a way that matters enormously for Bavi. When a hurricane threatens the American mainland, people assume that someone somewhere is measuring it directly, that we know exactly how strong it is. And for the Atlantic, that assumption is largely correct. There is a specialized unit, famous in weather circles, that flies airplanes straight into hurricanes. They punch through the eye wall, they drop instruments into the core, they measure the pressure and the winds firsthand and radio the numbers back. These are the hurricane hunters, and they are the reason Atlantic intensity estimates are so reliable. When a storm is coming for Florida, we do not guess. We fly in and check. Out over the western Pacific, where Bavi is intensifying right now, none of that happens. There are no routine reconnaissance flights. There have not been for decades. The program that once flew into Western Pacific typhoons was shut down back in the late 1980s, and it was never brought back. So for the strongest storms on the entire planet, the ones that form in this exact basin, we have no one flying in to measure them directly. Everything we know about Bavi's strength, every wind estimate, every pressure figure you will hear over the next few days does not come from an instrument inside the storm. It comes from looking at it from space. The method has a name. It is called the Dvorak technique, after the scientist who developed it, and it is genuinely clever, but it is still, at the end of the day, an educated interpretation rather than a direct measurement. Forecasters study the pattern of the clouds in satellite images, the shape of the spiral, the temperature of the cloud tops, how tightly the eye is formed and how symmetric it looks, and from those visual clues they estimate how strong the storm must be. Decades of experience have made this method reasonably good. But reasonably good is not the same as certain. Two skilled analysts can look at the same storm and come up with somewhat different numbers. The technique can lag behind a storm that is changing fast, and it can be fooled, in both directions, by storms that do not look quite the way the textbook says they should. Think about what that means for a storm like Bavi, which is forecast to undergo rapid intensification. The one time the estimate is hardest to pin down is precisely when a storm is changing quickly, and rapid intensification is the definition of changing quickly. So we are in the strange position of watching a storm that may be climbing toward historic strength, using a tool that is at its least reliable exactly when the storm is doing its most dramatic thing. The true peak intensity of Bavi, the single strongest moment of its life, may be something we can only ever estimate, never confirm. This is not a small footnote. It sits at the center of the whole story, and it is why I keep coming back to it. Remember those extreme model runs, the ones flirting with the all-time record, the numbers that should not be possible. Even if Bavi does reach some staggering, record-threatening intensity out over the open ocean, we may never be able to prove it, because there will be no aircraft in the eye to read the pressure. We will be left with satellite estimates, with a range of possible values, with forecasters saying it was probably somewhere in this neighborhood. The strongest storm on Earth could rise and fall, at its most extreme, entirely unmeasured, witnessed only by the cold, patient eye of a weather satellite 22,000 miles up. There is something almost humbling about that, and something a little haunting. We live in an age where we think we measure everything, where we assume there is a sensor for every event and a precise number for every phenomenon. And yet here, over one of the emptiest parts of the planet, one of the most powerful events nature can produce may unfold beyond the reach of our instruments. Not because we could not, in principle, fly into it, but because we chose, long ago, not to keep the planes flying out here, and so we watch these giants from a distance, guessing at their true faces. For the people on the islands, this uncertainty is not a philosophical curiosity. It is a practical nightmare, because it makes preparation harder. How do you brace for a storm when the experts themselves are honest that the estimate could be off by a category in either direction? The only rational answer is to prepare for the strong end of the range, to assume the monster is as bad as it might be, because the cost of under-preparing for a super typhoon is measured in lives. So the islands prepare for the worst version of a storm whose true strength no one can quite pin down. Hold the whole thread together now. A monster forming over the hottest water on Earth, aimed at small wounded islands, undergoing a violent surge in strength that outruns our warnings, and doing it all beyond the reach of any instrument that could tell us for sure how bad it really is. To grasp just how bad the worst version could be, we have to talk about the number the models keep whispering, and the storm that set the record they are whispering about. To do that, I have to take you back to 1979, and to the single most powerful storm ever measured on the face of the Earth. It is worth knowing why the plane stopped, because it was not a scientific judgment that reconnaissance had become unnecessary. It was, in the end, a matter of budget and geography. Flying into Western Pacific typhoons meant operating aircraft far from home bases over an enormous and remote ocean at great expense, and in the late 1980s that program was ended. The storms did not stop forming. We simply stopped flying into them. For nearly 4 decades since, the most powerful cyclones on the planet have been left to the satellites, and every so often, when a storm like Bavi appears, the old argument about whether we should bring the planes back flares up all over again. This is not to say the satellites are blind. Modern instruments are remarkable. Some can peer through the upper clouds using microwave sensors to reveal the structure of the eye wall underneath. Others read the roughness of the sea surface to estimate the wind. Together they give forecasters a far richer picture than the grainy images of decades past. But there is one thing no satellite can do. It cannot reach into the eye and directly read the central pressure, the truest measure of a storm's power. For that, you need an instrument physically inside the storm, and over the Western Pacific there is none. So the single most important number, the one that would tell us whether Bavi is truly approaching the record, is precisely the number we cannot directly measure. The consequences of that gap are not abstract. Emergency managers on the islands have to decide how many shelters to open, whether to call for evacuations, and how to position their limited resources, and they must make those decisions based on estimates that could be wrong in either direction. A storm underestimated is a storm people underprepare for. A storm overestimated erodes the trust that makes people listen the next time. Getting the intensity right saves lives, and doing it from space alone, for a storm in the middle of rapid intensification, is one of the hardest things this science is ever asked to do. Bavi is about to ask it again. Part 10. 870. In the middle of October, in the year 1979, in almost exactly the part of the ocean we have been talking about tonight, the atmosphere produced something it had never produced before in the entire history of human measurement, and has never quite matched since. Its name was Typhoon Tip. And to understand why Bavi has forecasters reaching for words like record, you have to understand what Tip was, because Tip is the yardstick, Tip is the ceiling, Tip is the number that the models keep whispering about when they look at Bavi. First, let me explain the number itself, because it is the truest measure of a storm and most people have never had it explained to them. When we talk about how strong a storm is, we usually reach for wind speed, because wind is what we feel and what we fear. But meteorologists know that the deepest, most honest measure of a storm's power is not its wind. It is its central pressure, the air pressure right at the calm centre of the eye. The lower that pressure drops, the more violently the surrounding air rushes in to fill the void, and the stronger the storm. Pressure is measured in units called millibars, or the nearly identical hectopascals. Normal air pressure at sea level is around 1013 millibars. A strong hurricane might drop to 950. A truly ferocious one might reach 900, or dip just below it. Anything under 900 is a rare and monstrous storm. Typhoon Tip, at its most intense, bottomed out at a central pressure of 870 millibars. 870. That is the lowest sea level pressure ever reliably measured in any storm, anywhere on the planet, in all of recorded history. It has stood as the world record for over 4 decades. To reach it, the air in Tip's core had to become so light, so evacuated, that the pressure fell more than 140 millibars below the normal surrounding atmosphere. The winds that answered that pressure drop reached about 190 miles an hour, and Tip was not only the most intense storm ever measured, it was also the largest. Its circulation spanned about 1,380 miles across, wide enough to blanket nearly half of the continental United States under a single storm. It was, by the numbers, the most powerful tropical cyclone the Earth has ever shown us. Now, why does a storm from 1979 matter for a storm forming tonight? It matters because 870 is the line that has never been crossed. It is the outer edge of what we have ever seen the atmosphere do. For nearly 50 years, no storm has matched it. Meteorologists have come to treat that number almost as a physical limit, a boundary that separates the storms we have witnessed from the storms we assume are theoretically possible but have never actually recorded. And that is exactly why the Bavi model runs have caused such a stir, because some of them have not been forecasting a strong storm, or even a very strong storm. Some of them have been forecasting a storm reaching down toward that 870 line, toward the record that has stood since Tip, toward the edge of what the planet has ever produced. Keep the thread with me, because Tip is where the scale of this becomes real. We have been following a storm forming over the hottest water on Earth, aimed at small wounded islands, surging in strength beyond our warnings, and doing it beyond the reach of any aircraft. Tip is the reason the word record is in the conversation at all. Tip is what it would mean for Bavi to become truly historic. When a forecaster says Bavi could be the strongest storm on Earth right now, what they are quietly measuring it against is the ghost of that 1979 monster, the benchmark that has never been beaten. I want to be careful and fair here, because intellectual honesty is the whole point. It is genuinely rare for any storm to seriously threaten Tip's record. In nearly 50 years, essentially none have truly matched it. The odds that Bavi becomes the single strongest storm in recorded history are low. I am not telling you that a new world record is coming. What I am telling you is something more subtle and in its own way, more remarkable. I am telling you that the models, the serious professional forecasting tools that guide these warnings, looked at the conditions around Bavi and produced solutions in which that record was in play. That does not happen for an ordinary storm. It does not happen most years at all. The mere fact that the machines are drawing numbers near 870 tells you something profound about how explosive the environment around this storm has become. So that is the ceiling. That is the ghost in the numbers. 870 millibars, 190 miles an hour, the largest and most intense storm ever measured, set in this same ocean in 1979 and standing untouched ever since. Now let me bring you back to the present, to the actual model runs that put Bavi in the same sentence as that record, and let me show you exactly what they were saying, why they were saying it, and how seriously you should and should not take them. Because there is a number that appeared on these forecast charts in the last day or so that made even seasoned storm watchers stop and stare. Here is a detail about Tip that makes Bavi's situation even sharper. We know Tip's record-setting pressure of 870 for a simple reason. Back in 1979, the reconnaissance planes were still flying the Western Pacific. An aircraft flew into Tip and measured that pressure directly, which is why it stands as a confirmed instrument-verified world record rather than a satellite estimate. In other words, the only reason we have a firm number to measure Bavi against is that, back then, we were still doing the very thing we no longer do. If a storm today were to match Tip, we might never be able to prove it, because the plane that measured the record has no successor over this ocean. The scale of Tip is genuinely hard to hold in the mind. Its circulation stretched about 1,380 miles across. If you had centered it over the United States, a single storm would have covered nearly half the country at once, from the middle of the continent to the eastern seaboard. Mercifully, Tip never struck land at its full, monstrous peak. It weakened before making landfall, which spared the world from ever seeing what a storm at the absolute limit of intensity could do to a populated coast. That combination, the most powerful storm ever measured, fading before it hit, is part of why it survives more as a scientific benchmark than as a household name. For more than 4 decades, that benchmark has held. Storm after storm, season after season, the atmosphere has produced ferocious cyclones, and none has quite matched Tip. That endurance is exactly what makes the record feel almost untouchable to the people who study these storms. It is the high mark of what we have ever witnessed the planet do. So when a model draws Bavi reaching toward that mark, it is not merely forecasting a strong storm. It is forecasting a challenge to a line that has stood, unbroken, for the entire careers of nearly everyone now watching. That is why the quiet whisper of 870 carries the weight that it does. Part 11. The number that shouldn't exist. Let me tell you about the moment this storm went from a regional concern to a global fascination, because it happened on a computer screen, in the output of a weather model, in the form of a single number that people who study these things simply were not used to seeing. The model was the European model, formerly one of the most respected and historically one of the most accurate long-range forecasting systems in the world. And what it drew, on one of its runs, was Bavi reaching a central pressure of around 871 millibars. On a later run, it showed something in the low 880s, positioned out beyond the Marianas, somewhere between the Philippines, Taiwan and Japan. Sit with those numbers for a second against what we just learned. The all-time world record is 870, and here was a mainstream professional forecast model drawing a storm at 871 and then in the low 80s above that. It was, in effect, forecasting a storm within a hair of the most intense tropical cyclone ever measured on Earth. People who have spent their careers looking at these charts said, more or less, the same thing. They said they had never seen a signal like it. Not that they had never seen a strong storm forecast, but that they had never personally seen a model reach down and draw a number that close to TIP's untouchable record. Now, the responsible thing, the thing this channel will always do, is to immediately put that number in its proper context, because a scary number without context is just fear, and fear is not what we are here for. So here is the context. That 871 millibar solution is what forecasters call an outlier, and it comes from a single deterministic run reaching almost a week into the future. Weather forecasting gets less certain the further out you go, and a week is a long way out for the details of a storm's peak intensity. A single run at that range is not a promise. It is one possible future among many. The official warning centres, the ones actually responsible for protecting these islands, are forecasting something more restrained, a storm that is still a dangerous super typhoon but not necessarily a record breaker. When you see that 871, you should read it not as this will happen, but as look how far the machine thinks this environment could go. But, and this is the part that keeps me honest in the other direction, you should not simply wave it away either, and here is why. History tells us that storms in this kind of environment can, and sometimes do, overperform even the aggressive forecasts. Let me give you the clearest example, one that should make anyone hesitate before dismissing an extreme number. In 2015, in the Eastern Pacific, a hurricane named Patricia underwent one of the most explosive rapid intensification events ever documented. In about a day, it went from a modest storm to a monster, and it bottomed out at a central pressure of around 872 millibars, essentially tying the world record set by TIP. Patricia proved something important. It proved that the ceiling is not just theoretical. Under the right conditions, the atmosphere really can build a storm at the very edge of that record, and it can do it shockingly fast. So when a model shows Bavi reaching for numbers like that, it is not drawing a physical impossibility. It is drawing something that has in fact happened before, within the lifetime of many people watching this. This is the tension you have to hold, and it is uncomfortable, and it is supposed to be. On one side, the record-flirting numbers are outliers, and the most likely outcome is a storm that is terrible but not historic. On the other side, storms over water this warm have genuinely reached those extremes before. Our ability to forecast the exact peak is limited, and, as we discussed, there will be no aircraft flying in to catch it if it does happen. The honest position is not to promise a world record, and it is not to dismiss the possibility. The honest position is to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, while preparing as if the strong end of the range is real, because for the people in the path, the strong end of the range is the only part that matters. Bring the thread all the way back, because this is where it comes to a point. We are following a storm forming over the hottest water on Earth, aimed at small wounded islands, surging in strength faster than our warnings, beyond the reach of our aircraft, and now flirting in the models, with the most extreme number the science has ever recorded. Each of those pieces amplifies the others. The warm water is why the record is even conceivable. The rapid intensification is how it could get there. The lack of aircraft is why we might never confirm it, and the wounded islands are why any of it matters at all. It all connects. It is all one story. There is a natural question rising out of all of this, and it deserves a clear answer. If the extreme models are outliers, then what are the responsible official forecasters actually saying? What is the real best estimate forecast, the one the islands are being told to prepare for, as opposed to the terrifying edge case? Because there is a real number, an official number, and it sits in a fascinating and slightly confusing place between the calm reassurances some people want and the record-breaking panic others are spreading. Let me show you what the people whose job it is to get this right are truly forecasting, and why even their careful, restrained numbers describe something the Marianas have every reason to fear. To understand how much to trust a frightening model run, you have to understand that forecasters do not rely on a single run at all. They use ensembles, which means running the same model many times with tiny variations in the starting conditions, to map out the full range of possible futures. If most of those runs cluster around a moderate storm and only one or two spike toward the record, that tells you the extreme is possible but unlikely. If the whole set crowds toward the extreme, that is a very different and far more alarming signal. The 871 millibar figure that made headlines was one striking solution, and the honest way to read it is as the edge of the envelope, not its centre. It also matters which model drew it. The European model that produced those numbers is not a fringe tool. It has a long track record as one of the most accurate medium-range forecasting systems in the world, the one many forecasters trust most when the guidance disagrees. So when it reaches down and draws a near-record storm, it does not get dismissed as noise. It gets taken seriously, and it gets watched closely to see whether the later runs back away or double down. That is exactly the tension that has had storm watchers refreshing the model output for days, waiting to learn whether the monster on the screen is a fluke or a forecast taking shape. This is the discipline that separates good storm coverage from bad, and it is the discipline this channel tries to live by. There are two easy ways to get a night like this wrong. One is to grab the scariest number and scream that a world record is coming, which is dishonest and cruel to the people in the path. The other is to wave the extreme away as impossible, which is complacent and in its own way just as dangerous. The truth lives in the uncomfortable middle, in the willingness to say plainly that the most likely outcome is a terrible but not historic storm, while refusing to rule out the extreme that the best model in the world keeps drawing. Holding both of those at once is hard. It is also the only honest place to stand. Part 12. What the experts are actually saying. Let me pull you out of the world of scary outliers and into the world of the official forecast, because this is the number that actually governs what happens on the islands, and it lives in a fascinating place between panic and reassurance. The people whose literal job is to protect the Marianas are not forecasting a new world record. But what they are forecasting is still, make no mistake, a genuine catastrophe for a small island. And understanding their numbers, including one apparent contradiction that confuses almost everyone, tells you exactly how much trouble is really coming. Start with the primary warning center for this basin, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, the American military and civilian outfit that issues the official warnings for storms like this. Their forecast calls for Bavi to become a super typhoon, with maximum sustained winds around 155 miles an hour near its peak, which is forecast for around the 5th of July, right as it reaches the islands. 155 miles an hour is not a number to file away casually. That is squarely in the range of a high-end Category 4, brushing against Category 5 on the scale most people know from Atlantic hurricanes. It is the kind of wind that does not just damage well-built homes but can destroy them, that strips roofs entirely, that turns unsecured objects into missiles and snaps power poles like matchsticks. Now here is where it gets confusing, and where a lot of people online tie themselves in knots, so let me clear it up. There is a second major agency watching this storm, the Japan Meteorological Agency, and their forecast lists a different set of numbers. They project Bavi as a very strong typhoon with sustained winds around 110 miles an hour and a central pressure of about 925 millibars. So one agency says 155 miles an hour and the other says 110. Is one of them wrong? Are they contradicting each other? No. And the reason is a technical detail that matters enormously for reading these forecasts correctly. The difference comes down to how long you average the wind. The American Center measures sustained winds over 1 minute. The Japanese agency measures them over 10 minutes. Wind is gusty and variable, so the longer you average, the lower the peak number comes out, because the brief strongest gusts get smoothed away over 10 minutes in a way they do not over 1. It is the same storm, described with two different rulers. Converted to the same standard, the two forecasts are actually telling a very similar story. So when you hear a lower number from one source and a higher one from another, do not assume someone is exaggerating or someone is downplaying. Check which ruler they are using. Both agencies agree that Bavi is going to be at minimum a formidable and dangerous typhoon. Let me translate that 925 millibar pressure figure, because we did the work earlier to understand what pressure means. Remember, normal is around 1013, and anything under 900 is a rare monster. 925 is not a world record, not by a long way, but it is a serious, powerful typhoon, the kind that appears a handful of times a year in the most active basin on Earth, and that leaves a lasting mark wherever it strikes land. And remember, that is the restrained forecast, the official best estimate, before you even consider the possibility of the storm overperforming toward those outlier numbers we talked about. The floor of this forecast is a severe typhoon. The ceiling is a possible record. The islands live in the space between those two, and both ends of that space are frightening. There is one more phrase in the official discussion that I cannot skip past, because it captures the historic nature of what is being forecast. The warning centre noted that Bavi could become the strongest July typhoon to directly pass through the Mariana Islands since the beginning of reliable records. Read that carefully. Not the strongest this year, not the strongest in a decade, the strongest ever recorded for the month of July to directly pass through these specific islands. Storms of Bavi's potential intensity are more common later in the typhoon season, in the late summer and autumn. To have one this powerful, this early, aimed directly at the Marianas, is itself unusual enough to make the record books, even setting aside the extreme model runs entirely. I want to underline the thread here, because it has been building all night, and now it locks into place. A storm is forming over the hottest water on Earth. It is aimed at small islands already wounded by a super typhoon this year. It is forecast to surge in strength faster than warnings can keep up. No aircraft will fly in to measure its true peak. The models are flirting with the all-time world record. And even the calm, restrained official forecast, the one designed not to cause panic, describes a potentially July record-setting super typhoon making a direct pass at 200,000 Americans on islands only a few miles wide. When the reassuring version of the forecast is still that bad, you begin to understand why nobody out there is relaxing. As of the latest advisories, the local weather office on Guam had said the potential for a typhoon passage somewhere in the Marianas was increasing, though formal watches and warnings had not yet been posted. Do not read that absence of warnings as a sign that things are calm. It is a sign of timing. Watches and warnings are issued in specific windows before a storm arrives, and as the hours tick by, they will go up. The absence of a warning on Thursday morning is not safety. It is the quiet before the machinery of an official emergency response fully engages. And that machinery is, right now, spinning up. So we have the ceiling, the record whisper, and we have the floor, the official super typhoon. What we need now is the schedule. When exactly does this happen? When do the first bands arrive? When does the worst of it hit? When is the last safe moment to prepare? And which of those 4 small islands is most likely to take the core? Because a forecast is only useful if you know the clock attached to it, and the clock on Bavi is ticking down toward a very specific and very dangerous weekend. Let me lay out the timeline, hour by hour, exactly as it is shaping up. Let me make 155 miles an hour concrete, because a number in the abstract does not convey what it does to a place. At that wind speed, well-built framed homes can suffer severe damage, including the loss of the roof and exterior walls. Most trees are snapped or uprooted. Power poles come down across whole districts, and the blackout that follows can last not days but weeks. Signs, roofing, unsecured vehicles, anything not tied down becomes a projectile moving fast enough to kill. This is the range where a community stops worrying about damage and starts worrying about survival, where the goal of every preparation narrows to the single aim of keeping people alive through the worst hours. And as we said, the wind is only one of the storm's weapons. On a small island, the storm surge, the mound of seawater the winds shove ashore can be the deadliest part of all, drowning the low-lying coastal strips where so much of island life happens. The battering waves riding on top of that surge can tear apart harbours and seawalls and everything built near the water, and the rainfall, more than 10 inches and possibly approaching 18 in a day or two, turns steep island terrain into a landscape of flash floods and landslides. When forecasters warn about a super typhoon striking an island, they are not warning about one hazard. They are warning about wind and surge and surf and flood arriving together, each of them able to kill on its own. This is why the warning timeline matters so much, and why residents should expect it to escalate quickly over the coming hours. First comes a watch, meaning typhoon conditions are possible. Then comes a warning, meaning they are expected and near. When those warnings go up for the Marianas, and they are increasingly likely to, they are not bureaucratic formalities. They are the official signal that the time for debate is over and the time for final action has come. The quiet Thursday with no warnings yet posted is not a reprieve. It is the setup. The warnings are coming, and when they come, they will come fast. Part 13. The Clock. A storm forecast is a story about the future, and like any story, it has a sequence, a set of moments that arrive in order. For the people on the Marianas, that sequence is the difference between being ready and being caught. So let me walk you through the timeline of Bavi as it stands right now, from the quiet present to the violent peak, because every hour on this clock carries a decision with it. Start with right now, Thursday, the 2nd of July. This is the calm before anything. Bavi is that 60-mile-an-hour tropical storm nearly 1,000 miles east of Guam, still organizing, still gathering itself. On the islands, the sky is probably ordinary. The sea is probably close to normal. Nothing about the view from a window would tell you what is coming. This is the deceptive phase, the phase where the danger is entirely in the forecast and not yet in the air. And it is precisely the phase in which the smartest preparation happens, because it is the only phase where you have time and calm at the same time. Move forward to Friday, the 3rd of July. This is the day the transformation is expected to begin in earnest. The forecast has Bavi crossing from tropical storm into typhoon strength, entering that rapid intensification window we spent so long on, beginning the climb that could take it towards super typhoon status. On the islands, Friday is still mostly a day of preparation under increasingly hazy skies, but it is also the day the forecast will sharpen, the day the track will narrow, the day it becomes clear which islands are most in the crosshairs. Friday is when the abstract becomes concrete. Then comes Saturday, the 4th of July. This is the hinge of the entire story, and it carries a bitter irony because it is a holiday, a day that is supposed to be about celebration, and instead it is the deadline. Forecasters covering these islands have been explicit and repetitive about this point, because it is the one that saves lives. Whatever you're going to do to protect yourself, they are saying, it must be finished by Saturday afternoon. After that, the outer rain bands of Bavi begin to arrive, the winds start to rise, the seas turn dangerous, and the window for safe outdoor work, for last-minute supply runs, for boarding up and tying down, slams shut. Saturday afternoon is the moment the door closes. Everything you did not finish before then, you will not get to finish at all. Sunday, the 5th of July, is when it becomes real. This is the day the outer bands give way to the core. Through Sunday morning and into the afternoon, conditions on the most threatened islands are forecast to deteriorate quickly, from squally and windy to genuinely dangerous. This is the day you do not want to be anywhere except your safe place, because by Sunday afternoon and evening, the strongest part of the storm begins its approach. The forecasts bring the centre of Bavi to the islands late on Sunday and into Monday, which means the worst of it. The eye wall, the peak winds, the highest surge, arrives in that Sunday night into Monday morning window. Storms are often at their most terrifying in darkness, when you cannot see what is happening and can only hear it, and Bavi's core is forecast to arrive largely at night. Monday, the 6th of July, is when the islands find out how they did. Through the first half of Monday, the core is forecast to be at or passing the islands, delivering the most violent conditions of the entire event. Then, through Monday afternoon and evening, if the forecast holds, Bavi begins to pull away to the west, into the open Philippine Sea, and conditions slowly, grudgingly begin to improve. Monday is the day of maximum danger followed by the first fragile relief, and it is also the day the true damage assessment begins. Now, which island takes the worst of it? This is where the forecast still holds real uncertainty, and it is the question people on the ground care about more than any other. As we touched on earlier, the models disagree. Some of the guidance, including the main American model, brings the centre over the northern islands, Tinian and Saipan, the same two islands that Sinlaku crippled in April. Other guidance, including the European model, pulls the track a little farther south, toward Rota and Guam. A shift of 50 or 60 miles decides which island is inside the eye wall and which is merely battered by the fringe, and because Bavi is forecast to be large, there is no truly safe option in the group. If the storm tracks north, Tinian and Saipan face the core while Guam and Rota take strong tropical storm to typhoon conditions. If it tracks south, Guam and Rota face the worst while the northern islands are lashed but spared the centre. Everyone in the chain gets hit. The only question is who gets hit hardest, and it is not only the wind. A storm like this brings water in 3 forms, all of them dangerous. There is the storm surge, the wall of seawater the winds pile up and push ashore, which on a low-lying island is a mortal threat. There is the pounding surf, enormous waves battering the coasts and harbours, and there is the rain. The forecasts suggest rainfall totals well over 250 millimetres, which is more than 10 inches, and locally perhaps as much as 18 inches, falling in a matter of a day or two. On steep island terrain, that much rain in that little time means flash flooding and landslides, a whole second category of danger layered on top of the wind. When a super typhoon hits a small island, the wind gets the headlines, but the water often does much of the killing. Hold the thread one more time because the clock makes it urgent. A monster is forming over the hottest water on Earth, aimed at small wounded islands, surging beyond our warnings, beyond our aircraft, flirting with the record, and now we can see its schedule, and the schedule gives these islands until Saturday afternoon, a holiday afternoon, to get ready for a Sunday night arrival of something that even the calm forecast calls a potential July record. That is the situation, laid out end to end. But Bavi, as enormous as it is not happening in isolation. It is one storm in an ocean that, right now, is unusually awake, and the wider picture is part of the story too. There is a second system already spinning. There are questions being asked about why all of this is happening at once, and some of those questions have drifted into territory we need to address directly and honestly. Let me widen the lens. There is a brutal geography to evacuation on an island that mainlanders rarely appreciate. When a hurricane threatens a coastline, you can get in a car and drive inland, putting 100 miles between yourself and the sea. On an island only a few miles wide, there is no inland to drive to. Moving to a sturdier shelter or a stronger, higher building is often the only option, because horizontal escape is physically impossible. The one true way off the island is by air, and that door closes the moment the airport shuts down and the last flights depart, which happens well before the storm itself arrives. So the decision to leave, if you're going to make it at all, has to be made early, while the sky is still calm and the choice still feels premature. That is the agonizing calculus playing out in homes across the Marianas tonight. Do you spend the money and the effort to get your family off the island entirely, while flights are still running, on the strength of a forecast that might yet shift? Or do you stay, secure your home, and shelter in place, trusting concrete walls and careful preparation against a storm whose true strength no one can promise you? There is no obviously right answer, and people are making that choice for their children right now, in the quiet before the bands arrive. Every one of those decisions is a small act of courage under uncertainty, and they are being made by the tens of thousands, all at once, on 4 small islands. And the timing of Bavi's arrival adds one final cruelty. The forecasts bring the worst of the storm through the islands largely at night, from Sunday evening into the small hours of Monday. There is a specific terror to riding out a great storm in darkness. You cannot see the water rising. You cannot see the roof beginning to lift. You can only hear it. The wind climbing to a scream, the pressure shifting in your ears, the sounds of things breaking somewhere out in the black, with no way to know how much worse it will get before the sun comes up. A storm that arrives in daylight is terrifying enough. A storm that arrives in the dark asks people to endure the unknown with their eyes closed, and that is exactly what Bavi is forecast to do. When forecasters say to be in your safe place by Saturday night, they mean something very specific, and it is worth spelling out. They mean the strongest interior room of the sturdiest building you have access to, away from windows, with your supplies already gathered around you, before the winds make going outside impossible. They do not mean checking one more time on the boat, or making a final run to the store, or driving across the island to a relative's house. By the time the outer bands arrive, all of those ordinary errands become potentially fatal. The safe place is not where you go when the storm hits. It is where you already are hours before, waiting. And the supplies that matter are humble and unglamorous. Water, first and most important, because the taps may stop when the power fails and may not run clean for days afterward. Food that needs no cooking. Medicine, for those who depend on it, in quantities that can outlast a long isolation. Light and batteries, and a way to hear official information when the internet and the cell towers go down. None of it is exciting. All of it is the difference between discomfort and disaster in the days after a super typhoon, when the storm has passed but the help has not yet arrived. On an island, the days after can be as dangerous as the storm itself, and they are survived on what you thought to gather before. Part 14. The whole ocean is awake. It is tempting, when one storm is this dramatic, to forget that it is not happening on an empty stage. Bavi is the headline, but it is not the only act. The Western Pacific right now is unusually active, and stepping back to see the whole ocean at once tells you something important about what is really going on, and it also helps answer some of the harder questions people are asking about why all of this is happening together. Even as Bavi churns toward the Marianas from the east, there is a second tropical system already spinning on the other side of the region, closer to the Philippines. This one is not forecast to become a monster, but it is no small thing either. It is expected to lift northward and bring tropical storm-type impacts and heavy rain as it goes, with the moisture streaming toward China and feeding into a frontal boundary draped across the region. That means, over the coming days, soaking rains and gusty conditions across parts of the Philippines, southern China, Taiwan, and even into southern Japan, with some areas seeing rainfall totals well over 100 millimeters. So while the world watches the giant to the east, a second, quieter storm is already delivering its own dose of dangerous weather to a completely different set of coastlines. Two significant systems, on opposite sides of the same basin, at the same time. That is the signature of an ocean that is primed and firing, and it circles us right back to the thing sitting underneath all of it, the warm water. We spent a whole chapter on how the Western Pacific warm pool feeds a single storm. Now zoom out and realize that same reservoir of heat is available to the entire basin at once. When the water is running warm across a huge region, it does not just build one monster. It raises the odds everywhere, priming multiple systems to spin up in the same window. The active pattern we are watching is not a coincidence of unrelated storms. It is what an overheated ocean looks like when you view it from far enough away. One warm ocean, several storms, all drawing from the same overheated well. This is exactly the point where a certain kind of question starts to surface, and I want to meet it head on rather than pretend it does not exist, because a lot of thoughtful people ask it, and they deserve a real answer instead of a smug dismissal. When two super typhoons take aim at the same tiny islands in a single season, when a storm suddenly appears flirting with an all-time record, when the whole ocean seems to light up at once, some people start to wonder whether this is really just nature. They ask whether something is being done to the weather. They point to things like weather modification programs, or to a facility in Alaska called HARP, and they wonder whether these storms are being created, or steered, or aimed on purpose. So let me address that directly and fairly, and then let me tell you what the science actually says. Start with the scale of energy involved, because this is the detail that settles it. A mature typhoon is not a big thunderstorm. The amount of energy it releases every single day, mostly through the condensation of all that rising moisture, is staggering beyond easy comprehension. It is on the order of hundreds of times the total electricity generation of the entire human race. It dwarfs, by an almost absurd margin, the output of every power plant, every weapon, every machine we have ever built, combined. There is no human facility, HARP included, that produces anything remotely close to that. HARP itself is a research instrument that studies the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere, far above where weather happens, and it operates at power levels that are, by the standards of a typhoon, utterly trivial. Asking whether HARP could create or steer Bavi is a bit like asking whether a single lit match could redirect a river. The energy accounting does not just make it unlikely, it makes it impossible by many orders of magnitude. What about the storm's path? The idea that it is being aimed? A storm's track is set by the large-scale winds around it, the position of high-pressure ridges and troughs that act like banks steering a river of air. These steering currents are enormous, they are visible in the data, and they are what let forecasters predict where a storm will go days in advance. Bavi is going west-northwest because the atmospheric pattern around it is pushing it that way, the same way it has pushed countless storms along similar tracks for as long as we have watched. There is no hidden hand on the wheel, there is just physics, operating on a scale so large that the whole idea of steering it by hand collapses under its own weight. And the two storms on the same islands question, the sense that the Marianas are being singled out. That one has a genuinely satisfying answer, and it is the answer we built earlier in this very story. These islands sit in the single most active tropical cyclone basin on the entire planet, directly in the path where storms most often form and strengthen. Getting hit repeatedly is not evidence of a plot. It is the tragic, ordinary consequence of geography. Living in the Marianas during typhoon season is living in the bullseye, and in an unusually warm year, the bullseye gets hit more often. It is not fair. It is not personal. It is just where the map put them. Even the fear about the models hiding something, the idea that the 883 millibar run reveals a secret catastrophe being covered up, gets the situation exactly backwards. Those extreme runs are not hidden. They are public. They are being shared openly, discussed openly, argued about openly, which is the precise opposite of a cover-up. The reason the official forecast is more restrained than the scariest run is not concealment. It is caution, the professional discipline of not betting everything on a single model solution a week out. The spread between the models is not a conspiracy. It is honesty about uncertainty, laid bare for anyone to see. So no, Bavi is not manufactured, not steered, not aimed, and not hidden. But here is the thing I want to leave you with as we close this widening lens, because it is stranger and, in a way, more unsettling than any conspiracy. The truth is that we did not need to build this storm. The ocean built it, out of nothing more than heat and air and time, using energy so far beyond our own that our largest machines are rounding errors beside it. We are not the ones doing this. We are the ones watching it, from the shore and from space, mostly unable to even measure it, let alone control it. And that brings us finally back to where we began, to the single question that this entire night has been circling, the question the next 72 hours are about to answer. There is a larger pattern behind all of this that deserves an honest hearing, without hype and without denial. As the oceans warm, the science increasingly indicates that the strongest storms are getting stronger, and that a growing share of them are undergoing the kind of rapid intensification that makes Bavi so dangerous. This does not necessarily mean there are more storms overall. The evidence is clearer about intensity than about raw numbers, but the ceiling, the peak that the most extreme storms can reach, appears to be rising along with the ocean heat, and events that would once have been rare are turning up a little more often. Bavi fits that pattern almost too neatly, a storm handed extra fuel by a sea running warmer than it used to. That is why the story of the Marianas, struck twice in one season before they could recover, may be a preview rather than a fluke. One of the quiet fears among people who study disasters is the arrival of what they call compound or consecutive events, catastrophes that hit the same place faster than it can rebuild in between. A community can absorb a terrible blow if it has years to recover. It struggles badly when the blows come only months apart. As the oceans warm and the stronger storms grow more common, the gap between disasters may keep shrinking in the most exposed places, and the islands of the Western Pacific sitting squarely in the bullseye are among the first on Earth to feel it. But I want to end this wider view where I began it, on humility rather than fear. We did not make Bavi, and we cannot stop it or steer it. The ocean built it, out of heat and air and time, wielding energy so far beyond our own machines that our largest works are specks beside it. Our role, in the face of something this size, is smaller and stranger than we like to admit. We watch. We measure what we can, which is less than we would like. We warn one another, and we prepare, and we endure. And afterward we look clearly at what happened and try to understand it, so that we are a little readier the next time the ocean decides to build a monster. That is the whole of what we can do, and tonight it is exactly what the Marianas are doing. Part 15. What we cannot see yet. So let me bring the whole thing home, and let me stand it back up in one piece, because we have travelled a long way, and it all resolves into a single sharp point. A storm named Bavi is taking shape over the warmest water on the planet. It is forecast to undergo a violent surge of intensification and become a super typhoon, possibly the strongest storm on Earth at that moment, and it is aimed directly at a cluster of small American islands that were already broken this year by a storm just like it. The models are whispering about a record that has stood since 1979, and there is no aircraft in the world flying out to tell us whether that whisper is true. Every thread we have followed tonight ties into that single knot. I have tried, all the way through, to hold two things at once, and I want to leave you holding them too, because it is the only honest place to stand. The first thing is restraint. The most likely outcome is not a new world record. It is a dangerous, destructive super typhoon, terrible for the islands in its path, but within the range of storms this basin has produced before. The extreme numbers are outliers, and outliers usually do not verify. If you take nothing else from this, take that the odds favour the merely awful over the truly historic, That is the calm, grounded truth. But the second thing, the thing that sits right next to the restraint and refuses to leave, is that the outliers exist at all. The machines looked at this environment and drew the record. Storms over water this warm have reached those extremes before, within living memory, and the one time we most need to know exactly how strong a storm is getting, during rapid intensification over the open Pacific, is the one time we have chosen to have no one flying in to check. So the responsible posture is not comfort, and it is not panic. It is preparation against a worst case we cannot rule out and cannot measure, which is a genuinely difficult thing to ask of anyone, and yet it is exactly what the people of the Marianas are being asked to do this weekend. There is something about this particular story that has stayed with me more than most, and I think it is the idea of watching without being able to measure. We live in a time when we believe we have counted and censored and quantified the whole world, when we assume that nothing enormous can happen without a precise number attached to it. And here, over one of the emptiest stretches of ocean on Earth, one of the most powerful things nature can create may rise to its full height and fall again, and the best we will ever be able to say is that it was probably somewhere in this range. The strongest storm on the planet, unfolding just beyond the reach of our instruments, seen only through the distant silent lens of a satellite. There is a humility in that, if we let ourselves feel it, a reminder that for all our tools, the planet still does enormous things without asking us, and sometimes without even letting us keep score. For the 200,000 people on those 4 small islands, though, none of this is philosophy. It is the most concrete thing in the world. It is plywood and fuel and water, and the question of whether the roof will hold a second time. It is a holiday weekend spent not celebrating but bracing. It is the particular exhaustion of having to be brave again, so soon after the last time. Whatever Bavi turns out to be, whether it fades into a merely bad storm or climbs into the history books unmeasured, the people in its path have to prepare tonight as though it is the worst version, because that is the only choice that keeps them alive, and so they are preparing right now as you listen to this, under a sky that still looks ordinary, for something that is coming across the water toward them at the speed of a bicycle and the fury of a bomb. We will be watching every hour of it. We will track the intensification as the satellites read it, follow the track as it sharpens, and tell you honestly what we can confirm and what we cannot. Because in the end, that is the whole job, to look clearly at something enormous and frightening and uncertain, and to refuse both the comfort of denial and the thrill of panic, and simply to say what is true. And the truth tonight is this. The strongest storm on Earth is taking shape in the Pacific right now. We can see it forming, we can see where it is going, and we cannot yet see how bad it will be, which may be the most unsettling thing of all, because the not knowing is not a gap in the story. The not knowing is the story, and over the next 72 hours the ocean is going to finish writing it, whether we are ready to read it or not.